My name is Claire Bian, and I am the president of ISPS-US. I'm really delighted to be hosting this webinar through chaos and calm, holding the experience of psychosis in the family with Jenny Sanders Kowalchuk and Joanna Monahan. Before the two speakers introduce themselves, I'd like to say a bit about ISPS-US, one of the dangers of reading introductions. I'd like to tell you a bit about ISPS-US and speak to the work that it does. ISPS-US is the US branch of the International Society for Psychological and Social Approaches to Psychosis, an international organization that promotes psychological and social approaches to helping people who hear voices or experience other unusual or extreme states, often called psychosis, through education and dialogue with mental health professionals, people with lived experience, family members, activists, and researchers. The organization was founded in Europe in the 1950s by psychiatrists who were critical of the ways in which the array of experiences associated with psychosis and often a diagnosis on the schizophrenia spectrum were being treated. Their emphasis on psychological and social approaches to psychosis and focus on trauma as the principal root cause for the array of vulnerabilities that can lead people who hear voices when they are distressed is significantly aligned with the Hearing Voices approach, which organization I'm also affiliated with. And with that, I am going to turn it over to Joanna and Jenny, who will introduce themselves.
So thank you to everyone for coming along today and to all who are going to be listening to the recording. I hear that nearly 400 people have registered, so that's really great news that we're going to be reaching so many people. Thanks to Leah, Christine, Claire and all the team at ISPS-US for giving us the opportunity to present the findings of our research here. Jenny and I both have lived experience of holding psychosis in the family and in friend networks, respectively. So this research really matters to us. And we look forward to hearing your responses to our findings and to hearing your questions and ideas about what might come next. Just to say a little bit about me before I hand over to Jenny, who's going to take us through the findings. I'm Joanna Monahan. I'm a psychotherapist in the UK, and I'm the co-founder of Safely Held Spaces, which is a small UK-based organisation that co-created and commissioned this research. And we'll be posting links in the chat as we go so that you can take a look at the Safely Held Spaces website, see what else we do, see our vision. And please do get in touch and get involved, or if you want to find out more or get involved in what we're doing. Just one final thing to say before I hand over to Jenny. Part of Safely Held Spaces' vision is to reimagine the language we use when we're talking about these kinds of experiences. So you'll see us through the presentation referring to experiences and holders rather than the language that might be of service users, patients, people with lived experience, and carers and family members. We use this language of experiences and holders to try and depathologize and reimagine the language that we use. So that's it from me. I will chip in occasionally as Jenny is presenting, and I'll come back at the end to talk through the implications and what we might do next. So thank you again for being here, and handing over to Jenny.
Well, thanks. That's lovely. Thank you, Joanna. Thank you, Claire. So I'm very excited about presenting this research as well, because I think we can really help you understand what's happening for the family through the experience of altered states. And we've worked to really look at the system rather than the individual. So this work should help shed some light on why family members behave the way they do when they interact with services, for one thing, and also help family members and friends understand why they're having a difficult time, because it can be very confusing. So I'll start by telling you how the research came about. So way back in 2019, before the pandemic, we had a workshop for holders, and it was a day that was designed to really explore holders' experience. And the day involved looking at that experience through the lens of somebody experiencing an altered state. So we looked at what that might be like for the person in a supporting role. Out of that work came feedback that suggested that the family was experiencing something slightly different, and that lens didn't fit very well for family members. And when I say family, I'm including friends and everybody with a relationship to the person experiencing. So I was very curious about this because I felt quite uncomfortable with being defined by my family members' experience. So I really wanted to understand what was going on for me. And the dialogue that Joanna and I had started with trying to understand grief, because one of the big things that comes out of the literature is we have an experience of grief. So that's where we started, and it took us on quite a journey. So the research question is, how can we describe holders' experience over time from the holder's perspective? We conducted a pragmatic literature review, and then we designed a survey that was comprised of, it was quite a long survey. It included rating questions and lots of open questions. So it was quite comprehensive. And from that survey, we then recruited 10 participants into depth interviews where we explored some of the issues that were raised in the survey in greater depth. And to design the instruments, we actually did that with family members. So everything's been co-produced, really. And at the end, the findings were taken back into a day-long workshop with holders to check the validity of our findings. So we can be fairly confident that what we've done represents the family experience. So the literature review. It's quite interesting when you actually look at the literature and look at it through the lens of the family, how it is shaped by the biomedical model, really. So how we're looking at how the questions about caregiver experience, how they arise, is through the lens of the biomedical model. The burden of care is very well described, and it describes negative impacts on the family of finances, health, social connection. And there's also a substantial, a growing literature that looks at the emotional response to support and identifies grief and loss as key themes or key experiences that holders are having. And that experience of grief and loss isn't very well recognised by services. So that emotional response isn't being met by statutory services. And following on from that, the other thing that becomes apparent is that there are also barriers to participation. So treating teams aren't very good at including family members, even though we have in the UK, we have very clear directives really that families should be involved, and that it is built into our law, policy and clinical practice. So those of us in the UK know that NICE guidance says that family must be included in treating decisions. And the evidence is, it's interesting how there's quite a growing literature around first episode, and that's because the first first episode generally is much better at including family. And there is evidence to suggest that once first episode treating teams finish working with a family, then the experience is not as good for families. And actually, when you look at the literature, you see this body of work coming out of first episode that's quite substantial, and then it drops off and it's replaced by the burden literature, which is quite depressing, really. So, I mean, the other thing that I would like to say about the literature is that the burden that is described is really an unnecessary burden. We shouldn't be carrying that burden. And if we had more social support in place, then the family's burden would be lessened. But there doesn't seem to be that critical analysis happening in the literature, and it could be because of who is asking the question. So when we looked at the literature as a whole, we did come to the conclusion that what we're looking at is really shaped by who is asking the question, why they're asking the question, and for what purpose. So the family and friends are often seen solely in relation to the person being treated, the patient. And the work of caring is seen as extending the work of the clinical team and taking it into the home. The roles of parents and siblings and friends are collapsed into this idea of the caregiver, which sounds, it sounds like we all know what it is, but actually we don't really know what it is. So the research is looking through the lens of how the family can aid a person's recovery. And what we wanted to know was, if we were to look at the family system as a whole, how would we go about finding well-being and balance again? What could we do to support the experience of families so that they also could find well-being? So there was a very lovely piece of work done about 30 years ago by an American social worker called Pat McGregor, and she had lived experience, and she found her experience to be quite baffling. And I've put this in here because not much has changed. So if we see what Pat McGregor had to say 30 years ago, it's pretty similar to what we found in our research. She said, "I know only that in all the therapy we participated in, and in all our communications with professionals who worked with our son, it was never suggested to us that our responses were an expression of normal parental grief, and that indeed we, as well as our son, had lost something very precious. The fact that the well-intentioned therapeutic interventions did so little for me only increased my sense of confusion and incompetence. In traditional medical settings is an underlying worldview that values family interactions and recognises that serious illness involves many kinds of loss. In the world of mental ill health, however, family relationships often seem to be viewed with deep suspicion at worst and uncertainty at best." So, we had a very good response when we recruited into the survey. We had 61 responses in the end, but we had more women than men, so more parents and mothers than fathers. We also found that our participants were skewed to those who had been supporting someone for a long time. And this may well be because we were unable to recruit directly through NHS networks, because as independent researchers we couldn't go through ethics and so we couldn't legitimately recruit through the health service. So that meant that we couldn't access the early intervention teams, parent groups, which is really unfortunate. It would have helped if we could, but even so, we do have quite a good range of responses.